I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
Tonight we are beginning lesson 3 of our study on how to deal with Bible difficulties. And the title of the lesson is Biblical Terms, or Bible words, must be defined by their context. And when it comes to context, we know when it doesn't come to the Bible, that we have words and phrases in English, and I'm sure Mandarin has idioms and phrases, where you are using words that in different contexts can mean different things. And the author has some riddles that he starts with, and he calls these multiple meaning riddles, and I'd like us to consider some of these riddles. Not all of them. We're going to do a couple of them. So the first one is, what has a horn and delivers milk? Well, you'd think, okay, yeah, cow. That has a horn and delivers milk. Although, I was thinking about it this afternoon. I didn't know if female cows have horns or not. I know the bulls do, but I think they do. They might have the small horns. And so we know, okay, well, that's got to be a cow. Well, his answer is a milk truck. And what would we mean by a horn in the second case? A vehicle horn. And so you got to understand, okay, there's a double meaning there. We know of the horn that comes out of the head, and a cow has 2 of those. And we also know of a vehicle horn. So in order to understand the riddle, you have to understand what horn we're talking about. What has a tongue but cannot talk? A shoe is the answer. But could there be another answer? What happens if someone has laryngitis? They have a tongue. Well, you could say an animal, but I think we're going to use the word talk here to mean communicate. Or the sound that comes out of their mouth. If I have laryngitis and can't speak, still have a tongue in my mouth, my vocal cords don't work. I could have a disease that means that I can't speak. And so we understand in English where words can have different meanings. The same word can have different meanings in different contexts. In his second example, he uses the word strike. Oh, sorry, I forgot because this is a question. Point 6 is a double entendre, or an adianoita. I had to look up how to pronounce that word. Is a word or expression that has 2 different meanings. Double entendre we usually use in a sort of an illicit way, where someone says something and there's an appropriate way to take it and an inappropriate way to take it. Doesn't have to be that way. Double entendre means 2 meanings. And so even though we've adapted that meaning in English to usually mean an okay answer, more of a vulgar answer, it can have a more innocent meaning than that. The word strike has 5 different meanings. In the first one, the prospectors make a strike yesterday up the mountains. What does the word strike mean in that sentence? Okay, yes, they're prospecting for gold. So they've struck gold. They found gold. In the second sentence, the union went on strike this morning. They've withdrawn services. They've stopped working. So the word strike could mean found something. The word strike can mean stop working. The batter, the Jays know how to do this, did this on Saturday. The batter made his 3rd strike and was called out. What does the word strike mean in that? He missed hitting the ball, hit the strike zone, so there's an area around the baseball plate where a batter is to try to hit the ball. If the batter misses the ball, if the batter fouls off the ball, or if they don't swing at it altogether and it's in that zone, it is a strike against you. And you only get so many of those before you're out. I'm going to change this because we're Canadian. Strike up, O Canada. What does that mean? So you're starting up a band. And then the fisherman got a good strike in the middle of the lake. That more maybe goes towards maybe the first one. But we can see in our English that one word can have different meanings. And a homograph are words that are spelled the same, but may or may not be pronounced differently. I'm thinking of read and read. Read, R-E-A-D, and read, R-E-A-D, are the same spelling. You have to read the sentence to understand, okay, read, he reads, that's present tense, or he read, that's past tense. And so we understand from English how we have words that you have to read in context. The same is true when it comes to Bible words or biblical terms. And we have to be careful that when we define words, sometimes we just rush to go to the dictionary. And as one of our questions gets to a little later, you can find 10, 12, 14 definitions for a word, like strike. And you have to allow the context of the passage to make the definition. You could have a whole different set of possibilities, but you don't know which one it is until you read it. So the first word that we're going to look at is the word Levite. When we think of Levite, what automatically comes to our mind? Priests. Okay. Why do we come up with priest? Levite doesn't have the word priest in it.
Well, we learned that study of the Bible.
Okay. So we have learned from our study of the Old Testament that Levites were priests. And that will get to our second example, servants in the temple. Naomi, you want to get Numbers chapter 4, verses 2 and 3.
Take the census of the sons of Kohath from among the sons of Levi, by their clans and their fathers' houses, from 30 years old up to 50 years old, all who can come on duty to do the work of the tent of meeting.
Okay. Now, we've said Levites are priests. Here, Levite is not a priest. He actually didn't put that in here. A Levite can just be a servant in the tabernacle. Sons of Kohath had a specific job when it came to the holy items in the tabernacle. When the tabernacle was moved from place to place, they carried the Ark of the Covenant. They carried the table of showbread. They carried the golden candlestick. The other houses of Gershom and Merari, they were the ones who carried the tent of the tabernacle, the curtains of the court, the posts of the court, and each of those tribes, or each of those families had their own things, but they were all Levites. They weren't all priests. House of Aaron were priests. But what's another way you can take Levite? A Levite. Maybe that's a more general term. Who is Levi? Yeah. Anyone who is descended from Levi is a Levite. So we have to understand the context. Okay, are we talking about the tabernacle? Or are we just talking about someone who descended from Levi? Because sometimes the context can just be talking about any old Levite in no context of the tabernacle whatsoever. Let's go get Exodus chapter 2, verse 1.
And a man of the host of Levi went and took as wife the daughter of Levi.
All right. So a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman, according to, he's using the Holman Christian Standard Bible. That's what HCSB means. And so that's why we don't get Levite there. But a member of the tribe of Levi that's not of the house of Aaron, who is called to assist a priest, is descended from the tribe of Levi. They're Levites. And so sometimes we're just talking about people descended from Levi. Levite women weren't priests. They weren't servants in the tabernacle, but they were Levites. And so we need to remember, and children under the age of 20, under the age of 30 couldn't work as servants in the tabernacle, but I think it was 20 when they started, or 20 or 25 when they started training for the work in the tabernacle. Up until that point, if they were a house of Aaron, they weren't priests. If they weren't old enough, they weren't servants. But they were Levites all the way up. And once you were too old, you couldn't work in the tabernacle. You weren't servants in that way, but you were still Levites. And so the point the author is making here is we have to understand what we're talking about. When we get to the parable, when we read the parable of the Good Samaritan, who are the three people that Jesus used in that to illustrate his point about loving neighbor? There was a man who fell among thieves, and there were three people who came by him. One was a Levite. Pardon me? The one was a priest. And the one was a Samaritan. Well, you might say, well, all priests are Levites. That's true. But all Levites aren't priests. And so Jesus was making a point. Not only was there a priest who was the priest of God, worked in the tabernacle offering sacrifices, but there were Levites who were servants in the tabernacle from time to time. They were of the religious class. And even they passed by on the other side. So we would say everyone who is quote-unquote religious passed by on the other side. And this dog of a Samaritan, as the Jews would say, he was the only one who stopped and cared for the Samaritans. And so in that parable, Levite is just used to mention someone who descended from the tribe of Levi. They weren't a priest. They just descended from the tribe of Levi. You have to understand, okay, how is the context using that word? Any thoughts upon Levite? That was just one of the opening ones. If not, do you have something?
No.
Okay. If not, we'll get to more, maybe a more interesting one when it comes to how the Bible uses this word versus how the world uses this word. And I think a lot, and even among brethren, are confused as to what this word actually means. And the word is church. There are two ways that the Bible uses church, and there's one way that the world often thinks about church. So let's start with the way the world talks about church. What do they think of when they hear the word church? A building or a place. And so we think, okay, the church is a place. It's a place that we go to. We meet at 3850 Finch Avenue East in Toronto in Suite 411. And people say, well, that's the East End Church. That's where the East End Church is. And that is not how the Bible uses the word church. The church is never used to describe a place. It is always used to describe people. And that's why some people I was reading online, is it better to use the word congregation instead of the church sometimes to get people to understand what we're talking about. And I don't believe it's necessary that we change words. We just have to change minds. We have to get people to pull out of their mind wrong ideas. We do that all the time where we say, okay, we've always used a word one way, but we're using that word incorrectly. Predestination is one of those words. Is the word predestination in Scripture? Yes, it is. It's in Romans chapter 8. Those he foreknew, God predestined. It's there. But a lot of people think, when they think of predestination, they think of God selecting people individually over another. Bill's reading or teaching us about respecting of persons or favoritism. And the Bible says God is not a respecter of persons, and then you have the doctrine of predestination, which makes God to be out a respecter of persons. Predestined, those whom God foreknew, those he predestined to be conformed to his Son, simply means Christians. Those whom God foreknew, those are the ones who are conformed to his Son. He didn't pick you over me or me over you. But we can use the word predestined as long as we know what it means. Well, we can use the word church as long as we know what we're talking about. But in Scripture, the word church is used two different ways. And let's deal with the first way. God's called out people in his kingdom. It comes from the word ecclesia, or ecclesia, depending on where you put the emphasis. And that simply means called out. The word Ecclesiastes, the book Ecclesiastes, comes from that word. That's why the book begins, the words of the preacher. And so it's almost like a sermon to a congregation, to a gathering. But this word here is people who are called out into the kingdom. There are two ways that this word is used. One is a local way. Tammy, you want to get 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and Henry, Romans 16:16. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1.
Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy, refer to the Thessalonians with God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay, so church is used there. What's this church? Church of the Thessalonians. And that's where sometimes we get our idea that the church is a place. No, the people are in a place. The called out people are in a place. They're in Thessalonica. But the church can meet anywhere. The Thessalonian church could meet in an upper room. They could meet by the riverside, in a public park, in rented facilities, and they could meet in different places on different weeks. The church of the Thessalonians are the called out, the saved, that grouped together in Thessalonica. And that would be the same in Corinth, the same in Ephesus and Colossae and Philippi. And it would be the same as if Paul wrote a letter to the church at East End. The church at East End contains people who are called out by God. We meet in this building. We've met in other places. This building does not make us a church. We could very easily decide that for whatever reason, we're going to meet at Bill's house on Sunday. Would we be the church at East End if the congregation got together at Bill's house on Sunday? Would we be the church at East End? Yeah. Why not? That's what we have decided to make ourselves known as. We would still be the church at East End, even though we didn't meet in this place. It's not the place, it's the who. Henry, Romans 16, verse 16.
Greet one another with a holy kiss. Churches of Christ, greet you.
Okay, now, where's the church here?
It's kind of speaking more, not really universal, but churches in Rome.
Well, he's speaking to Rome,
You're right. Yeah.
but it's churches everywhere. And so, this isn't just, these are the churches that Paul knows. So it might be, Paul's in Corinth when he writes when he writes the book of Romans. That's what the 16th chapter would teach us, is that Paul's in Corinth when he writes the book of Romans. And so he could have said the church at Corinth greets you. But of course, he's been traveling through Macedonia and Philippi and Berea and Troas and Ephesus. So all these churches, the churches of Christ, not the name of a denomination, that's known as the Church of Christ, not a collection of churches as denominations. This time, the church denotes who the saved, called out people belong to. When we call ourselves, if we call ourselves the Lutheran Church, who do we say we belong to? Luther, Martin Luther. When we call ourselves, if we call ourselves the Baptist Church, what are we saying we believe in? Doctrines taught by John Smith. Baptist teaching. When we call ourselves the Church of Christ, we are saying we belong to Christ, but we only belong to Christ if we actually belong to Christ. And so, this is a more general term talking about local churches. Each local church that Paul knew greeted the Romans. Not a collection of denominations, each local church. But Paul didn't have time to write each local church, so he wrote the churches of Christ. And that's what he chose to write. That's a local term. Talking about local bodies of Christ, local called out people. But the scriptures also use the called out people as in a universal sense. And we'll come back up to Naomi, Matthew chapter 16, verse 18.
And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
The English Standard uses hell there. Oh, that's interesting. They've gone back to an older word. Gates of death, gates of Hades. But on this rock I will build my church. I will build my ecclesia. I will build my called out people. I will build my kingdom. Where is this church? Pardon me? It's global. Who is a part of this church then? Those who have been called out. Those who have been saved by God. Now, I will contend this church contains people even who have died. we are not taken out of Christ's church simply by death. When we talk about this church, when I die, if I was a member at the Church of East End, when I die, I cease being a member of the church at East End. So I'm no longer here. I'm no longer a member of this congregation. But I'm still part of Christ's kingdom. In Jesus' parables, and even Jesus' sayings, when he says, well done, good and faithful servant, and he says, you're now going to enter the kingdom, the scriptures in the book of Matthew especially it says the kingdom will go on in heaven. The church is not a stopgap for this earth. The church is not said to have ended when Christ comes again. The congregation, the group of all the saved, will be together in heaven. But that's the church. That's the kingdom. The kingdom doesn't end at Christ's return. 1 Corinthians 15 says Christ returns the kingdom to God who gave it, but that God may be all in all. But God's still going to rule. Still going to have his kingdom. It's going to be only the collected of those who are saved, those who are added to Christ's church. So we have the church used always as a who, not a where. It's always a who. Sometimes it's a local who. Sometimes it's a universal who. A collection of everyone who has ever been saved. But the scriptures also use the word church in the sense of a congregating people. A people that congregate together. And so let's see this in action. Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7, verse 38. This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles with us. Now, we can have the word that is used there is ekklesia. That's the Greek word used there, which means assembly or church. The verse could have very easily read, this is he who was in the church in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to them at Mount Sinai. Now, it wasn't translated that. Why do you suppose it wasn't ekklesia there was translated congregation and not church by our translators? Well, he hadn't built his church yet. But this isn't talking about, the word here is still ekklesia even before Christ.
But ekklesia meant something.
Yes. See, you're getting to the point I'm making. So we think of the word church as a New Testament term. And we want to avoid confusing people. And so, from the context, the people who read it in Greek knew exactly what was being meant, because yes, you're right, it means assembly. When we translate it as church, you are using it in a New Testament way. Christ's church. But it can be used, the word church can be used just to mean assembly. It can be used that way. So when we talk about the church, the Baptist church, it's a congregation of Baptists, not Christ church. Different. That's where people get confused. It's not Christ church because it's not following Christ. But it is a church because it's a congregation of people. They're following Baptist teaching, which is false doctrine. And so we need to realize the scriptures does use the word church, ekklesia, to simply mean congregation. In Acts 19, that was Acts 37:38, by the way, was at Mount Sinai. God was together with the assembly of Israel. we go to Acts 19 and read verse 39. There we read, But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in the lawful assembly. This is in Ephesus. Remember, the Ephesians had stormed and gathered together illegally, trying to kill Paul in Ephesus. And the city clerk basically told them, you have courts to go and challenge what Paul's doing. Go there. If you have any other business, all right, we need to have a lawful assembly, a lawful ecclesia. This could be a church here, not a church that follows Christ. The word itself means assembly. It's not translated that way, but it could be. We could call our legislature in Queen's Park the legislative church. Now that would obviously make people think it's a religious body. That's because church is used as a religious word. Doesn't have to be, though. It's not exclusive, though. How do you determine it? You determine it by the context. Hebrews chapter 2 in verse 12 is actually a quote from Psalms 22. And verse 22, I will declare your name to my brethren in the midst of the assembly. I will sing praise to you. In the midst of the assembly, in the midst of the church. The point I'm making here is that the word church we often use in a religious sense, in a New Testament sense, to mean Christ's church. To mean Christ's assembly. But the Bible is translating the word ecclesia, which means assembly, congregation, and church. If church means assembly and means congregation, that means I can use those interchangeably. It's not one word that means three different words. No, I can use those. But our translators are smart in the way that we understand words. And so they use sometimes congregation, sometimes assembly, because they understand, okay, this is not Christ's church that he promised in Matthew 16. It's something else. And so in order not to confuse people, we're not going to use the word church there. Could use the word church, because the word is ecclesia. And that's my point, is we got to read the context. And that was the author's point here, is you got to read the context to understand what the word means that we're talking about. So let's skip ahead to page 18. What does the word adia noeta or double entendre mean? Two different meanings. Okay. Now you can come up with what are some definitions for the word lead or led?
Bow tie and bow down.
All right. Sorry. Say it again.
I thought bow tie and bow down.
Okay.
Same word.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm on question 2 for lead or led. What are some definitions of that word?
Well, even as a verb, if you go before or escort somebody.
Okay. To guide someone. It also means to direct someone on a course, to lead them. To serve as a channel for, it's a lead. To go through, to suggest. I found this interesting. The word can mean to bring to a conclusion, but it also can mean to begin. Same word can mean two different opposite things. There also is the metal that's known as lead, and so the word can be used that way. To have a result, you got to read the sentence to understand whether you're talking about whether it's which lead it is and whether it is pronounced lead or led. It's the same word. What's a homograph?
word
Word
spelled the same, but removed.
that's spelled the same might be pronounced differently. And then there are two different types of Levites. Priests, house of Levi, servants in the temple. So priests, servants in the temple, or just members of the house of Levi. And our last one, true or false. The word church always refers to a religious gathering of Christians in the Bible. And that's false. It is false. The church, the word itself, in the New Testament context, is usually translated as a religious gathering of Christians. But the word ecclesia means assembly. And so every time you see assembly, you could use the word church there and not be wrong. You generally don't, so as not to confuse. But you could.
I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word.